everyone, and welcome back to this week's Torah portion and Bible study. I first just want to apologize for two things. First of all, I want to apologize that we didn't get to upload a teaching last week. We had some technical difficulties, but we'll be covering last week's teaching and this week's teaching today. And I also just want to apologize if I sound nasally. It's winter in South Africa, and with the load shedding and everything, it gets quite cold sometimes. So I'm a bit nasally. I'm sorry for that. Okay, but let's get started. I'm very excited as always. So we're going to be looking at last week's portion, which is Acharei Mot, and that's chapter 16 to 18 of Leviticus. And we'll also be looking at this week's portion, which is Kedoshim, and that covers chapters 19 and 20 of Leviticus. So Acharei Mot means after the death, and it's after the death of Aaron's two sons. That's where we get the Acharei Mot from. And then we'll also be looking at Matthew and Mark this week to try and link them to our week's portion. Okay, so let's do our chapter overview. So for Acharei Mot, chapter 16 deals with after the death of Aaron's sons, God starts teaching them and instructs them on how to enter the Holy of Holies on the day of Yom Kippur service. We'll be looking quickly at that, as I don't want to cover it, because then what will we cover at Yom Kippur, right? Then chapter 17 is some kosher laws, some additional kosher laws or dietary laws, and laws concerning animal slaughter. And then lastly, we'll be looking at chapter 18, which are the laws concerning prohibition. So chapter 18 is the laws concerning sexual prohibition, which is quite a sensitive topic to cover, and Grant Luton does it amazingly. His previous cycle that he did, so not this year's cycle, the cycle before that, he really covers this chapter well, and I think with a lot of wisdom. So if you have kids, please go and listen to that teaching. I'll link it in the comments below as well. But go look at that teaching. He really covers it well in the sense of what does it also mean for us today, and how he's linked the digress of how one thing leads to another. And so if you don't stop at the one thing, it's going to lead to the next thing. Then next we'll be looking at this week's portion's chapters, and this week's portion is, like we said, Kedoshim, and that comes from the word Kadosh, which means holy. So chapter 19 really actually expands upon the 10 commandments and just puts them in a different light and rearranges them, and it just talks a bit more about them. It's a brilliant chapter to read. And then chapter 20 is a repeat of chapter 18, so it's again the sexual prohibition. But what it does is chapter 18 says, don't do these things. And chapter 20 says, but if someone does, this is how you will treat them. And in almost all of these cases, the punishment is death. So God takes sexual purity very seriously. And Grant said something profound. He said many people they create for themselves a God. They create a God that suits them. So if you are a person that's very hard on yourself and very strict on yourself, then you will serve a God that's like that. And if you are a free-for-all type of person, you'll create a God for yourself like that. If you don't follow the commandments to the T, what will happen is you will expect God to adjust to you instead of you adjusting your life to his word. Okay, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I really want to cover this later on with the Yom Kippur service, but I read some things and listened to some things, and they spoke of how Yeshua fulfilled the Passover lamb for us. He was the goat that is driven off into the cliff. He was the goat, these goats are for the Yom Kippur service. He was also the goat that was sacrificed at the temple. He also fulfilled the roles of the person driving up the goat off the cliff, as well as the high priest. And so these are some things to think about, how Yeshua came to fulfill these things, and we'll expand on it later when we get to Yom Kippur. But maybe there's something that you can get from this for your own life, and to think of how much he achieved for us. and that we sometimes get stuck at the Passover lamb part, but there are steps after that. And so when we get to the Yom Kippur service, I'm looking forward to covering this. What I want to start with now is chapter 17, and it speaks of blood and that we are not supposed to eat blood. And so we've had a lot of discussions in our friend groups about blood, and I made contact with some people that are far way more wiser than me to ask some advice and ask, how is this actually understood and to what extent? So I'm going to read through the scripture first, and then once we've read through it, I'm going to explain what the feedback was from these people. So when someone from the community of Israel or one of the foreigners living with you eats any kind of blood, I will set myself against that person who eats blood and cut him off from his people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for yourself. For it is in the blood, for it is the blood that makes atonement because of the life. So I first of all want to say that God makes it clear here. This is not only for the people of Israel. Any foreigner living among them should follow these same laws. The second thing is that in Judaism, there is no real understanding of what does it mean to when God says that he will cut someone off from his people. What is widely understood is that the responsibility of the consequences does not rest on the people of Israel, but that God will take the consequences into his own hands at his own time. And it's never good. It's a punishment, okay, that a punishment follows this. So I want to talk about this blood thing, right? Because I think it's in chapter 19, I can't remember, it might be in this chapter or chapter 19, but where it speaks of if an animal's blood is drained onto the land or into the soil or onto the ground, it depends on your translation. Once that happens, all the blood is drained from the animal. That is considered a kosher slaughtering, as soon as all the blood is drained out. Now, the reason God told them to do that is there were no fridges in that time. There was no hygiene. So it was one point was there's a big hygienic advantage. Science has proved that now a few years ago of how things, if they don't drain the blood properly, the meat becomes infected. Okay, so that's the one thing, that's the practical thing that we can link it to today. So practically, you can say for us today, okay, this is not okay to do. The spiritual part is that the life is in the blood, and God says we don't do this. Now, if you take meat, and because there are a lot of questions about raw meat and whether you should eat something medium or medium rare, for example. And the advice that I got is that each to his own, but we are not the Torah police. And let's not police people on this, because biblically, the rule is that all the blood should be drained out. And as soon as all that blood is drained out, the meat is, as is, fine to be eaten. If you feel that the raw meat has blood in it still, and you want to cook it to the extent where you see no juice coming out, that is correct. That is biblically correct. If you want to eat it raw, that is also technically biblically correct, as long as all the blood is drained out. So it's not my place to tell you what to or what not to do. You need to go find for yourself and really ask God, where is his heart with this? The example that I got back was that it's understood that we shouldn't eat blood and we shouldn't eat fat. And it's also understood that microscopically it's impossible to remove all of every microorganism of blood and every microorganism of fat out of meat. Okay, and that's where I'm going to end that conversation. So yeah, so it is a difficult topic. If you want someone to give you an amazing explanation about this, that teaching that I said earlier with the sexual prohibition, that exact same teaching, Grant covers this topic thoroughly. So if you want to learn more about this, you can also click on that link and listen to that teaching. I'm definitely not wise enough to know what is the correct thing to say here, but I know that these are things that we need to talk about. So I don't want to shy away from talking about it, but I also want to be honest to say that biblically, the draining of the blood is the most important thing. And I also just want to say that every butcher, currently, if you live in a modernized society, the butchers do that. It's considered normal practice that all the blood is drained. Okay, let's move on. So we are not to eat blood because it's for atonement and the life is in the blood. That was God's purpose for blood. And you see in some cultures that they will take blood and they'll add it to meat and they'll make sausage out of it, for example, and then they'll eat the sausage. That is what God is talking about. We do not eat the blood. Okay, adding it in, it's not a good idea. Okay, then chapter 18 talks about the sexual prohibitions and that they have consequences if these rules are not followed. If you break these commandments, God is quite serious about it. Now, you can go read through the chapter. They're quite self-explanatory. It is basically saying that there should be no sexual relations between anyone except a husband and a wife. Okay, not your father or your mother or your father's wife or your sisters or your brothers, your aunts, your uncles. That's basically what it's saying. What I want to focus on is a bit deeper into this. So let's read. This is in chapter 18, verses 24. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, because all nations which I'm expelling ahead of you are defiled by them. So basically what God is saying here is he's saying that all of these things in chapter 18, the people of Canaan, they are doing these things as normal day-to-day practices. And that's why I'm driving them out before you. That's why I'm giving you this land, because this land will no longer allow for these iniquities to take place upon it. The land has become unclean, and this is why I'm punishing it. The land itself will vomit out its inhabitants. So what we are going to be looking at actually is this word punishment, or punishing it. That's why I am punishing it. And I just wanted to add for you that this word vomit, this is the first time that it's used in the Torah, which means that this will always be its reference, its main definition is how in the context that it's used here. Okay, so if we look at the word punishment, we know that things, if we do something wrong, there is a consequence. There's a consequence for iniquity. There's a consequence for not keeping God's commandments. But it's interesting because the word punishment is also the same word as the word iniquity in Hebrew. It's the word avon. And so you can see here it means perversity, evil, fault, iniquity, mischief, punishment of iniquity. Okay, so avon is also used in conjunction with punishment of iniquity. Okay, so the first place this word is actually used in the Bible is with Cain, when he said to God, my punishment, my avon is greater than I can bear. As the first place is used in Genesis 4, verses 13. And so his iniquity was too great for him to bear, but so was his punishment. Okay, so that's the context of this. And I think it's very interesting because what he did is he shed his brother's blood. Okay, and that was, and then God punished him. And so I want to talk about Matthew 15, verses 10 to 20. And I personally link this to Leviticus chapter 17. So let's read through this. Okay, I know it's a long piece, but I thought it better if I put it on the screen so that you can read along with me instead of me reading out of the Bible. Then he called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand this. This is now Yeshua speaking. What makes a person unclean is not what goes into his mouth, rather what comes out of his mouth. That is what makes him unclean. The Talmudim came to him and said, Do you know that the Perishim were offended by what you said? So let's just get the context here. This whole chapter, it starts off with the sages teach us that they washed their hands before they ate. And then they said this washing of the hands, they elevated this very clean rule. It's a good thing to do if you don't want to get disease, but they elevated it to a level of Torah. They made it a Torah law without it being in the Torah. It's nowhere in the Bible that if you wash your hands, your food will become unclean. And if you eat that, if you do not wash your hands, your food will become unclean. And then you will become unclean. And then you must be set out of the camp. Okay. So they, the people of that time elevated this rule to a higher standard than what it was a man-made law. And they made it to be as good as a God-made law. And Yeshua said that is not true, because it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of your mouth. And so then the Pharisees took great offense to this because they made this rule. Okay, so I'm here at verse 30. He replied, every plant that my Father in heaven has not planted will be pulled out by the roots. This is a plant that God did not plant. This is a man-made plant. Okay, this is not, God didn't give the roots to these commandments. Let them be, they are blind guides. When a blind man guides another blind man, both will fall in a pit. This Kepha is Peter, said to him, explain the parable to us. So he said, don't you understand even now? Don't you see that anything that enters the mouth goes into the stomach and passes out into the latrine? I just want to say that Yeshua would never think that the food that they are eating are unclean food. Yeshua is speaking specifically about kosher, clean food that God has ordained for us to eat. For example, we know that animal products, certain products are unclean for us to eat. And so that would never be considered food. So this, I just want to make that clear first of all. Second of all, what the Pharisees taught here was that even the fruits and vegetables that you touch will become unclean. And we know there's no fruit and veggie list for us in the Bible of clean and unclean. There's poisonous and non-poisonous, but no clean or unclean. And so they basically said that your dirty hands can defile something that God has created and ordained as clean for eating. And that's what Yeshua is trying to say to them, that that's impossible. In verse 18, but what comes out of your mouth is actually coming from your heart. And that is what makes a person unclean. For out of the heart comes forth wicked thoughts, murder, adultery, and other kinds of sexual immorality, theft, lies, and slander. These are what really makes a person unclean. But eating without doing, and this I cannot pronounce that, but it's the tradition of washing your hands, does not make a person unclean. And so what God is what Yeshua is basically saying here is that what makes us unclean, if you think of the leper, we talked about the leper is the sin on the inside. It's the secret things. It's the things that you think. It's the things that you entertain. It's the sin that you have in secret. And your heart is hidden. Your heart is not open for everyone to see. It's things that come from the inside that is what makes you unclean and what makes you a person that will be considered defiled or have to go through a cleaning ritual. It's not the washing of the hands. And so the sexual immorality of chapter 18, for example, those are things that will make you unclean. It is not something that will be open to the public to know. Okay, so it's often the secret things that takes place in our homes that makes us unclean. And I just want to make sure that you know that Yeshua did not at all speak about food here. He was trying to say that we as human beings cannot make laws that override God's laws and overrides his creation. And the second thing is that keeping all of these laws that the Pharisees made means nothing if their hearts are wicked. Okay, let's look at Mark 12, verses 28 to 34, and I linked this to Leviticus chapter 18. And so one of the Torah teachers came up and heard them engage in this discussion. Seeing that Yeshua answered them well and asked them, which is the most important mitzvah, and that mitzvah, that's commandment, of them all? Yeshua answered, the most important is, and this is interesting for me if you think logical about this, right? The first commandment that Yeshua is referencing is Deuteronomy 6. Okay, and often when I grew up, and I grew up in the Christian communities, when I thought of the commandments, I only thought of the 10 commandments, which one of those are the greatest commandments. And so I would think we are keeping the 10 commandments because Yeshua referenced to the 10 commandments. But then if you think of the most important one he referenced is not one of the 10 commandments, it's actually something that's in Deuteronomy 6. Okay. And I think that's very important to realize that that we had such a warped understanding of why we shouldn't keep Torah is because Yeshua had done away with it. And this is one of the evidences for me that Yeshua didn't do away with the Torah, because he's referencing the Torah constantly. But when he speaks about the commandments, he doesn't just refer to the 10 commandments. And I think it's very important that we all just note that and realize that. Okay, so which is the most important commandment of them all? And Yeshua answered, the most important is Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your understanding, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you are to love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other mitzvah greater than these. The Torah teacher said to him, well said, Rabbi, you speak the truth when you say that he is one, and that there is no other beside him, and that loving him with all one's heart, understanding, and strength, and loving one's neighbor as oneself, mean more than all the burnt offerings and all the sacrifices. This links back to Matthew that we just listened to. You can keep all of these commandments also to the letter, but if you do not love God, and you do not love your neighbor, they don't mean anything. Your offerings and your sacrifices will be empty. When Yeshua saw that he responded sensibly, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. After that, no one dared to put another question. So what I want to us to look at is sin and iniquity comes from our hearts, right? Yeshua said that it's what comes out of your heart that makes you unclean. My mom always says that the enemy does not want you to do what the enemy wants you to do. As long as the enemy can get you to follow your own heart, your own desires. I'm not sure if my mom or grant that says this, but if you can follow your own heart, your own desires, give into your own will, give into your own plans, then the enemy has won. Because our heart is where we feel. We experience our thoughts there. We do, if we do not practice caution, it's also where we will act out our own will. And so the heart represents our soul. It's our mind, our will, and our emotions. Okay? And our soulish deeds and our soulish reactions will lead to iniquity. If you desire a woman you shouldn't desire, that's a sin that you act upon out of your heart. The desire comes from your heart, because your desires of your heart should be either God's will or it will be the opposite. There is nothing else. If it's not God's will, it will bring iniquity. It will bring sin. It will bring problems for you. And so it's a daily choice that you have to make. Yesterday's right choices mean nothing if you choose to ignore them today and act upon these emotions and these things that you feel in your heart. Okay, so the only thing standing between you making a decision out of your soul or making a choice out of your spirit is the act of making the decision. You have a choice. You can choose what you want to do. And it's often when we, sometimes we become blind with frustration or rage or anger or grief and despair. And it's sort of as if the animal nature, the soulish part of us takes over, and we say things we regret, we do things we regret, we humiliate ourselves, we humiliate someone else. And the reason that happens is because we lack the fruit of the spirit, which is self-discipline, for example. Okay, and so if you identify this in yourself, where you sometimes become blind to your emotions and you give into them and you give sway to them and you say and do whatever you want, and then you come back and you calm down and quiet down and you realize, oh, I've just made a fool of myself, or that was really stupid of me to say. I said so many things I regret. Whatever it is, right? That's you reacting out of your soul. And Yeshua says that is what makes us unclean. Because the moment I act out of my soul and I say something I shouldn't have said, and it hurts my neighbor, then I didn't love my neighbor. Okay, so I didn't follow those commandments. And the way we treat people reflects how we feel about God. If we treat people poorly, if we just let loose on people, then that reflects something about how we feel about God. Because God commands us, he says, these are the two greatest commandments. I am one, and you must love me with all your heart, with all your soul, right? Give that soul part of you, give it to me. Don't you give into it. Give it to me. Give your emotions to me. Talk to me. Have this conversation with me. Get your peace with me first, and then you go and you sort the problem out, or you get a solution to this. It's a decision. And I want to just say something else about this. I was talking to someone and she said to me that people often look at people that make right decisions and think it comes easily. And then they think, well, that person is just, that's who they are. It comes easily. They just get it. That whatever your excuse is. But they don't often realize that it is not easy. It is built up resistance of failing many times to do the right thing or make the right decision, and it becoming a habit to stop and say, I have a choice here. I have a choice to become angry now. I have a choice to rant off. I have a choice to throw something or whatever it is. It's years and years and years and years of practice for them to get to that point of self-discipline. And I'll say it again if I haven't, maybe I haven't said it before, but if you pray for patience, God is not going to give you patience. He's going to give you situations in which he can test your patience. And by you becoming more patient over time is the only choosing to be patient. You will not have it in you. You will have to choose that option against your soul, against what you feel. You must choose to be patient, or choose to be kind, or choose to have discipline. It is a choice, okay? It's not something that some people just have and others don't. Some people choose to practice it and others just give into their souls. Okay, so you choose the commandments, right, that you want to keep. You choose if you want to keep one of them. You choose if you want to keep all of them. Okay, you choose if you want God to suit the commandments that you pick, or you choose if you are going to align your life with all of God's commandments. It's your choice. You choose. You choose to say, Hear, O Israel. You choose to love God. You choose to love your neighbor. And so this is the starting point, is a choice between God is one, he is my God. I will love him with everything that I have, and I will love my neighbor equally, because my neighbor is a reflection of God. And I listened to this thing where And I'm going to quote this girl a bit later as well, but she spoke about the reason why in Judaism it's so important to love your neighbor is because they believe we all come from the same body. The body of Messiah is one body. And just like your left hand won't harm your right hand, if you think of opening something, right? I have a little pen with a cap here. I cannot really open this cap easily without making use of the other hand. My left and right hand do things together every day that I don't even think about. It opens the toothpaste, it puts it on the toothbrush. I brush my teeth. Sometimes while I'm doing that, I'm cleaning a bit around the house. I'm one of those people that do that. You know, if you think of opening a book, I hold the book in this hand. This one opens the pages. The reason why your neighbor is important is because we all come from God. We come from the same body. And the body is designed to complement each other. The body is designed, whatever the left eye doesn't see, the right eye catches. Whatever the left ear doesn't hear, the right ear catches. And so the whole idea is that you shouldn't bring harm to your own body. Okay, and the moment you harm your neighbor, the moment you act out of your soul towards your neighbor, you are harming your own body. You are harming your own body of the kingdom of Messiah. Okay, and so this is the starting point. Every decision that you make starts here. Is this part of who God is because he's one? Is this the character of my Father? Is this in accordance with love for my Father and love for my neighbor? That's your starting point for decisions. Okay, and like in true Hebrew culture, that's also where you should finish off, because our God is not a linear God. It doesn't start here and end here. We loop the whole time. We do the same feasts every year. We go through the same portions every year. We do the same Bible readings. God likes repetition because practice makes perfect. And so at the end, once you've made your decision, go through these things again. Is this God's character? Is this in accordance with love for God, love for my neighbor? Okay. And then in between your starting point and your finishing point is the Torah, full of commandments to tell you how to do every single thing, what to do, how to do it, when to not act, when to say something, when to not say something. It explains to us how to hear God, how he wants to be loved, and how he wants us to love his creation, who is our neighbor. And so the way you treat the creation reflects how you feel about the creator. Rob Bell said this. And so your reactions do matter, because if it comes out of your heart, it will probably lead to sin. Okay, we should react out of our spirit. That's the purpose of the spirit. The purpose of the spirit is to guide us. The purpose of the spirit is to make sure that we hold on to God, and that the animal nature does not overwhelm us into believing what we see with our eyes and feel with our hearts, because what we see and feel is not always the truth. It's not fact. It's not reality. And so choosing to not believe it, choosing to not act upon it will help you to be spiritually stronger, but also to not break God's word in your day-to-day life. Okay, so what does it look like if your decision comes out of your spirit? And so before I read this girl, I don't know how old she is. She's probably in her 20s. I found her on Instagram one day, and I've been following her ever since. And she's the one that gave the analogy of the left hand and the right hand. We all come from the body of God, and therefore that's why we shouldn't harm each other. Please go follow her on Instagram. I put her handle in the quote as well. She's brilliant, you know, and she's just a girl who wants to help people to be better. And I've never listened to one thing of hers that was contemptuous or filled with pride or anything. She's absolutely lovely, and she has amazing things that she says. Sometimes I'm like, what is this girl saying? It is a revolution for me. So please go follow. I'm going to read the quote now. Okay, so Judaism believes that, okay, so this is what she says. We are told that if we react in anger towards a situation, it is equivalent to idol worship. But why? Where is the connection? The core belief in Judaism is that everything in our life comes from Hashem. So when we act in anger or frustration towards a certain situation, we are essentially denying this fact that what is happening to us is coming from Hashem. When we act in anger, we are not believing that what is manifesting in our life is coming from Hashem. She talks a bit on after this, but this is what I wanted to get at, is that they believe that everything is God. Even the bad things, God allows for it to happen, and therefore it is He. Nothing in your life can happen without His say-so, without His okaying of it. So He must have a purpose. And so the question is, do you trust God? And if you trust God, you don't give in to your heart and your heart's reactions, and you try not in a negative way, and not in a negative, positive, toxic way, but having faith in knowing that God is in control, and not acting upon the things that you want to say and want to do. Sometimes you feel like you know, the other day, I heard someone say that they want to smack someone through the phone, you know. And maybe if that person was the in person, they might have thought, I want to shake you awake a bit, you know, not acting upon that. I want to shake you awake feeling, knowing that God has a purpose with this. Why am I getting upset? Why am I being triggered? That's your responsibility, is to make a decision to say, I will be faithful in trusting in my God. Okay, so let's recap. I tried to put in a bit deeper questions for us to recap on this week. Yeshua is the Passover lamb and both goats of the Yom Kippur service. If he lived a life like the one we should live, right? Because we should live like Yeshua lived. How do we become part of these services and give to him back what he gave to us? Soulish reactions versus spiritual reactions are a choice. Do you know the rules well enough so that you are making the right choices? And then life is in the blood, and we must treat life with respect, and we must love our neighbor like ourselves, right? And our mouth and our hearts can make us unclean, to the point where the land we live on can vomit us out. Are you taking in your land, or do you feel as if you are being thrown out? Okay, because that should tell you more or less what is happening in your life. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a lovely week. Shabbat Shalom.